As you may know, a few hours ago in Rome, the first Australian saint was canonised, Mother Mary McKillop. The occasion has seen an outpouring of national pride. Her image is actually being projected onto the pylons of the Harbour Bridge at this very moment. There are screens in the middle of the city to carry the telecast of the canonisation ceremony. But there has also been an unprecedented discussion about miracles, prayer, healing, the problem of evil, the benevolence and the limits to God's power in the media generally. Some of it makes for painful reading because alongside the stories of grace and hope and restoration, there are stories of grief, of devastation, of deep anger. In the last week, we have all rejoiced in the rescue of the Chilean miners, which seems a miraculous answer to so many prayers, and yet what of the other 10,000 miners around the world who lose their lives every year? What of their prayers and the prayers of their families? Does God not care? And it seems to me that when we come to talk about prayer, that same conflict is played out in our own hearts. Prayers that you and I have offered have not been answered. Prayers for things which are transparently good, in which there is not an element of self-interest. Not prayers to win the lottery or find a parking space, but prayers for sick babies and young parents and terrible suffering, which every fibre of our being tells us is profoundly wrong. Why assure us that prayers will be answered when they are not? That God is eager to respond when silence and inaction seem to be more likely? And the lesson that we tend to take away from this parable today only confirms that suspicion. God is fundamentally not interested in whatever it is we want. God is inclined not to listen or respond to our needs, but if, like a tape recording, we repeat, "Give me, give me, give me," long and loud enough, then God's inherent resistance might make an allowance for persistence. Of course, that's not exactly the point that Jesus is making. In fact, it's the complete opposite. Over the summer, we heard Jesus asking in chapter 11 of Luke's Gospel, "Who among you would hand your child a snake when he asks for a fish, or a scorpion when he asks for an egg?" And his point is that if you know how to care for your children, how much more will God care for you? He asked that question in a discussion about prayer, the same discussion that includes the Lord's Prayer. And now, 6 chapters later, in another discussion about prayer, he returns to exactly the same contrast. If even you can be persuaded to listen to the cry of the poor and the dispossessed, if even you can be stirred to some sense of justice and compassion, then how much more promptly and generously will God respond? Will God delay long in helping? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice. But is that our experience? I want to offer a few reflections. The first is that time and again, and sometimes in spectacular fashion, my prayers have been answered, and answered with painstaking attention to detail. As I have said on other occasions, I carry the answer to my prayers in my arms every day. And if no other prayer of mine is ever answered, it is enough. It didn't seem like an answer to prayer at 4 o'clock this morning, but I'm striving to take the long-term view. And I find it impossible to imagine that the attentiveness of God, that a God of such tenderness, would flag. And I suspect that none of us has far to reach into our own history to recognise the unmistakable hand of God at work. The answer to our prayers is next to us. It is around us. We are surrounded by holy gifts. We are filled with sacred memories. And our failure to cherish them is unworthy both of us and of them. The central act of what we do here every Sunday is to remember what has been done for us, this long history of God saving and redeeming his beloved ones. A history that reaches right down to this place, to this day, to you and me. And finding in those memories reasons for profound gratitude. And so before anything else, to doubt that our prayers are answered seems to be an act of extraordinary amnesia. And as I've said before, if you doubt that your prayers have been answered, if you doubt that your life is blessed, then just get on a plane and fly a few hours south of here, and that should change your mind. But what about those unanswered ones? Well, the second point I would make is that prayer actually doesn't change God. God doesn't change. That's sort of the point of being God. We sing in that well-known hymn, "We blossom and flourish like leaves on the tree, and wither and perish, but naught changes thee." Prayer only changes us. God is creative energy. God is the pure, exuberant, effervescent source of life. God is incapable of authoring death or pain or illness or suffering of any kind. God cannot make people die. God cannot make people sick. God cannot cause landslides or tidal waves or volcanic eruptions. Or God ceases to be God. And so prayer is not arguing God out of some preordained catastrophic course of action, talking God round to a reasonable point of view. God's will is clear, transparent, trustworthy, without any shadow of threat or violence. And no prayer of ours can change that in any way. But prayer does change you and me. And I don't mean that sort of quick prayer thrown up in an emergency, but that deep, protracted dwelling in prayer that you and I have all done at some stage in our life, and known that this is not only desperately important and agonizingly painful, but that in the process we are changing ourselves. Because that prayer immerses us in God. It opens us up to God's ways and God's thoughts. And so all of the prayers sort of filter away and become just one prayer. The one prayer that was found on the lips of Jesus himself. Thy will be done. This deep trust that all is safe, that all is in God's hands. And the third point is really a corollary of that. If our children were to hand us a list of their expectations, detailed instructions on how you and I are to think and behave, what we are to give them and when, accompanied with the warning that failure to comply with their instructions will sever any future relationship. I doubt that our response would be entirely positive. And yet, isn't this exactly how we treat God? We reduce God to some sort of vendor, and our prayer to phoning in our order. There are many reasons for remembering that God is in fact God. Remember the opening to that same hymn, immortal, invisible, God only wise, in light inaccessible, hid from our eyes. You and I have also had the experience, I suspect, of praying for something that we wanted badly, that seemed absolutely perfect, followed by the devastation of watching that dream come to nothing, to crumble into dust. And recovering from that loss can take months, it can take years. But I think most of us have also had the experience of realizing that at some level we dodged a bullet. That dream, which seemed so right, would have certainly been a disaster. We don't have the measure of much. We operate out of a very limited perspective. We grasp very little of the complexity of life. The only thing about us that actually stretches towards infinity is our capacity to love. That's why Paul says our knowledge is imperfect, our prophecy is imperfect. And so just as we expect God to treat us as individuals, to respect us, perhaps allowing God to be God would put many things into perspective, most of all our prayer. And there's one other thing that I want to add. When we imagine ourselves into this parable, when we reach into the dress-up closet looking for our costume in this little play, our tendency is to reach for the babushka, where the poor little widow on her knees. Could I suggest reaching for the judge's wig and gown instead? You see, like the judge, we have enormous power and influence and connections. We enjoy freedom of speech, freedom of association. We have money, we have resources. We can make the justice that so many people crave for a reality. The same justice that God overwhelmingly desires and wills for his children. You and I can answer prayers. People within this country and without, people being persecuted and tortured now, people suffering famine and disease, people being profiled and unjustly imprisoned, to say nothing of the expanding ranks of the unemployed, the homeless, the working poor, those caught in this vortex of poverty in this country. They are looking to you and to me to see that justice is done. To see that the legislative process is not abused to exclude and discriminate, but implemented to promote respect and tolerance and the just distribution and worthy stewardship of all our resources. And we are their only hope. So sign the petition, wear the button, send the email, write the letter, make the phone call, vote. That alone would be